At 2:47 p.m. on January 29, 1945, First Sergeant Leonard Funk stepped around the corner of a shattered farmhouse in Holzheim, Belgium, and stopped cold. 90 German soldiers were standing in front of him, not tied up, not guarded, not surrendering. They were staring straight at him. Half of them already had weapons in their hands. The others were bending down, calmly picking rifles out of a pile lying in the snow. 4 American GIs knelt nearby with their hands locked behind their heads. Funk recognized them instantly. They were his men. 20 minutes earlier, those Germans had been prisoners of war. Now they were free-armed and organizing to strike Company C from behind. A German officer stepped forward and jammed an MP-40 submachine gun into Funk's stomach. He screamed an order in German, his face red with rage. Funk didn't understand a word, but he understood the math. 90-1. No cover, no backup, no escape. One squeeze of the trigger, and he would be dead. And then in a moment when any sane man would have surrendered, Leonard Funk began to laugh. Not a nervous chuckle, real laughter, loud, uncontrollable. The officer froze. The Germans hesitated. Confusion rippled through the line. They had never seen this before. What none of them knew was that in less than 60 seconds, 21 German soldiers would be dead. The rest would be surrendering, and the laughing Americans standing in front of them would earn the Medal of Honor for one of the most unbelievable acts of combat in World War II. The laughter in that frozen Belgian farmyard did not come from madness. It came from a lifetime that had shaped Leonard Funk long before a German gun was pressed into his stomach. He had been born far from battlefields on August 27, 1916, in Braddock Township, Pennsylvania Steel Country. Smoke hung over the Monongahela River. Mills roared day and night. Men learned early that nothing was given and everything was earned. Funk grew up fast. By the time he finished high school, during the depths of the Great Depression, he was already carrying responsibility on his shoulders, helping raise his younger brother, while dreams like college quietly disappeared. When Congress expanded the draft in 1941, Funk didn't dodge it. He answered. 24 years old, 5'5", barely 140 pounds. The kind of man recruiters assumed would push papers behind a desk. Instead, Funk volunteered for the paratroopers, an experiment so dangerous most soldiers called it suicide. Jumping out of aircraft into enemy territory with nothing but fabric cord and faith. Airborne training was designed to break men, endless runs, brutal jumps, bodies hitting the ground wrong. Half washed out, Funk didn't. He endured, quietly, methodically. When he finally stepped out of a C-47 for the first time, every instinct screamed to grab the door and live. He let go anyway. By the time he reached England and joined the 82nd Airborne, Funk was older than most of the men around him. 27 felt ancient among boys, barely old enough to shave. But what he lacked in size, he carried in steadiness. He didn't talk much. He didn't boast. He simply did his job, and when things went wrong, men noticed they felt safer standing near him. That calm would be tested soon, over Normandy, over Holland, and ultimately in a snow-covered Belgian village where surrender was expected and laughter became a weapon. That steadiness was put to the test in the early hours of June 6, 1944, Normandy, D-Day. At 1:30 in the morning, Leonard Funk stood inside a vibrating C-47 as German flak tore holes through the darkness outside. The aircraft shuddered with every explosion. Red tracer rounds sliced past the windows like burning knives. Funk was loaded down with nearly 60 pounds of gear, weapon ammunition, grenades, rations, everything a man needed to fight, and everything that could drown him if he landed wrong. The plane was flying far too low. There was no room to climb, no room to turn back. Then the green light snapped on. Funk stepped into empty air. The prop wash slammed into him like a truck. For a heartbeat, there was nothing but chaos, wind noise, fear. Then the parachute opened, and the world went eerily silent. Below him lay occupied France, enemy territory in every direction, and nothing went according to plan. German fire scattered the airborne drops across miles of countryside. Men drowned in flooded fields, crushed under their own equipment. Others landed directly on enemy positions and were killed before they could free themselves. Funk hit the ground hard. His ankle twisted violently beneath him. The pain was immediate, blinding. Every step would be agony, but he could still walk. And if he could walk, he could fight. Alone and 40 miles from his intended drop zone, Funk buried his parachute and moved into the dark. By dawn, he had gathered other lost paratroopers, men from different units, confused, wounded, scared. They looked to him without discussion. Leadership was not assigned, it was assumed. For 10 days, Funk led that group through German-held territory. They moved at night, hid by day, fought when cornered. Despite his injured ankle, Funk insisted on walking point, placing himself between his men and the unknown. 10 days, 40 miles, not one man lost. When they finally reached Allied lines on June 17th, Funk didn't celebrate. He simply kept going. Normandy had taught him a lesson he would never forget. Chaos favors the man who stays calm when everything else collapses. Normandy didn't slow Leonard Funk down. It hardened him. By the time the summer of 1944 bled into fall, he was no longer just surviving the war. He was moving straight through it, step by deliberate step. On September 17, 1944, the sky over Holland filled with aircraft. Operation Market Garden had begun the largest airborne assault in history. Tens of thousands of paratroopers dropping into the Netherlands, racing to seize bridges that could crack open Germany itself. If it worked, the war might be over by Christmas. If it failed, men would die surrounded far from help. Funk didn't know the grand strategy. He never did. He only knew his orders: jump, secure the ground. Kill the enemy before they killed you. After landing, Company C did its job. Drop zones secured. Movement forward. Standard airborne work. And then Funk saw something that didn't belong. On high ground nearby, 3 German 20mm anti-aircraft guns were hammering the sky. The barrels flashed again and again, ripping into incoming Allied gliders. Each glider carried men jeeps, artillery, medical supplies, everything airborne troops needed to survive. Every burst meant more bodies before they even touched the ground. The position was well dug in. Sandbags, camouflage, interlocking fields of fire. Around 20 German soldiers defending it. By doctrine, an assault like that required overwhelming numbers. Funk had 3 men. He didn't hesitate. Leading from the front, Funk moved uphill into fire. Bullets snapped past them. Dirt kicked up around their boots. There was no cover, no pause, no safe angle. Only forward. They hit the perimeter hard, killing the security detachment before the gunners could react. Funk charged straight into the gun pits, firing point blank, silencing one weapon, then the next, then the third. In minutes, it was over. 20 Germans lay dead or dying. The guns went silent. The gliders came in untouched. For that action, Funk would receive the Distinguished Service Cross, second only to the Medal of Honor. Most men would carry such a moment for the rest of their lives. Funk barely had time to register it, because the war wasn't finished with him yet, and it was about to show him something that would change how he faced death forever. Holland ended, but whatever illusions remained about this war ended with it. On December 16, 1944, the Germans struck back with everything they had left. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, 3 armies surged forward under cover of snow and fog. Tanks, artillery, infantry. Hitler's final gamble. For the Americans, it was chaos. Units shattered, lines collapsed. Men surrendered simply to survive the cold. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. The weather was merciless. Temperatures plunged below zero. Weapons froze. Trucks wouldn't start. Men died in foxholes without ever seeing the enemy. And then one day into the offensive, something happened that spread through the American army faster than any official order ever could. Near a crossroads outside Malmedy, a group of American soldiers, artillery observers, radio men, rear echelon troops ran into an SS armored column. They were hopelessly outmatched. After a brief fight, 113 Americans surrendered, hands raised, weapons dropped, prisoners of war. They were marched into a snowy field. And then the SS opened fire. Machine guns tore through the line. Pistols finished the wounded. Men who tried to crawl away were hunted down and executed at point-blank range. 84 Americans were murdered in the snow. Some survived by lying perfectly still among the dead blood freezing to their clothes as German boots walked past them. When night fell, 43 men crawled back to American lines and told what they had seen. The message was unmistakable. This war no longer had rules. When Leonard Funk heard about Malmedy, something inside him locked into place. Normandy had taught him chaos. Holland had taught him initiative. Malmedy taught him certainty. He understood now what surrender meant when SS units were involved. He understood what happened to men who trusted the enemy to show restraint. From that moment on, Funk made a quiet decision. He never spoke it out loud. He didn't need to. He would never surrender. Not to save himself. Not for the odds. Not with a gun to his chest. And very soon in a snow-covered Belgian village, that decision would be tested when surrender was demanded and laughter became the only answer. By late January 1945, the German offensive had been smashed. The Bulge was collapsing. Now it was the Allies who were advancing slowly, brutally through snow ice and shattered villages. The Ardennes no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a graveyard that hadn't finished filling yet. Company C of the 508th Parachute Infantry received orders to take a small Belgian village called Holzheim. On a map, it looked insignificant. 15 houses, a crossroads, another name to be erased. But there was a problem. Company C was badly understrength. The executive officer had been killed. Too many men were wounded or gone. There weren't enough rifles to do the job cleanly. Leonard Funk was now acting executive officer. He studied the roster, then looked up and made a decision that would have terrified most commanders. He walked into the rear area tents, clerks' cooks, supply men, soldiers whose war had been paper and crates, not bullets. "You're infantry now," he told them. Grab your weapons. We're taking that village." They marched 15 miles through waist-deep snow under a driving blizzard. German artillery harassed them the entire way. Shells cracked the frozen earth. Men stumbled, exhausted fingers numb inside their gloves. Funk stayed at the front, setting the pace, never slowing. When they reached Holzheim, he didn't give speeches. He gave orders. The assault was fast and violent, house by house, room by room. German machine guns barked from windows. Grenades echoed through hallways. Funk's improvised platoon followed him anyway. Clerks turned riflemen, discovering what fear really felt like. When it was over, 15 houses were cleared. 30 Germans captured. Not a single American casualty. Another unit secured the far side of town and brought in 50 more prisoners. 80 Germans in total. They were herded into the yard of a farmhouse. Funk looked at his men, exhausted, frozen, still shaking from the fight. Resistance remained elsewhere in the village. He could spare only 4 guards. "Keep them here," he said. "We'll send help when we can." Then Funk turned and went back into the battle. He didn't know that a German patrol was already moving through the snow toward that farmhouse. He didn't know his prisoners were about to become attackers. And he didn't know that when he came back alone, everything he had decided after Malmedy would be called due in full. When Leonard Funk turned back toward the farmhouse, it was supposed to be routine. A quick check, a word with the guards, confirmation that the prisoners were still secure. Just another small task in a village already bleeding into silence. He rounded the corner and walked straight into a nightmare. The yard was full of Germans, not sitting, not contained, standing, moving, organizing, rifles in their hands, machine guns being positioned. His 4 guards were on their knees in the snow, disarmed, helpless. The prisoners had been prisoners no longer. A German patrol, ghost-like in white camouflage, had slipped through the chaos and turned everything upside down. There were 90 of them now, 90 armed enemy soldiers, and Funk had walked in alone. For a split second, the world narrowed to cold math. 90 rifles, 1 man, no cover, no time. Somewhere else in the village, Company C was spread thin, clearing houses' backs exposed. If these Germans struck now, it would be slaughter. Funk saw it instantly. He also knew there was no way out. A German officer noticed him. The rank on Funk's sleeve made him a prize. The officer strode forward and slammed an MP-40 into Funk's stomach. He screamed in German voice, cracking with authority and fury. "Surrender. Drop the weapon. End it now." Funk didn't understand the words, but he understood Malmedy. He understood what surrender meant in snow and silence. He looked at his men on their knees. He looked at the weapons lining up behind him. And in that moment, the decision he had made weeks earlier came due. He would not surrender. Instead, Leonard Funk began to laugh. Not softly, not politely. He laughed hard, bending slightly shoulders, shaking. The officer froze, his rage twisting into disbelief. Soldiers glanced at one another, unsure. This wasn't how Americans behaved. This wasn't fear. This wasn't compliance. Those few seconds, those stolen seconds of confusion, were everything. Still laughing, Funk reached slowly for his Thompson, as if finally obeying. The officer watched, relaxing just enough. And then, in one violent motion, Funk ripped the weapon down, brought it to bear, and pulled the trigger. The laughter stopped. The gunfire began. What the German officer saw in that frozen farmyard did not look dangerous. He saw a short American, small frame, snow on his boots, no helmet visor down, no defensive posture. Just a man standing alone laughing like he had already lost his mind. To the officer, this wasn't courage. It was shock. Fear breaking through the human brain the way it always did. The officer had seen it before. Men cried. Men begged. Men froze. Some laughed right before they collapsed. This American was no different. 90 rifles behind him. 4 prisoners on their knees. The outcome was already decided. So the officer made a fatal assumption. He assumed the American was beaten. He assumed laughter meant surrender was coming. He assumed time was on his side. That was the mistake. Because while the officer was interpreting behavior, Leonard Funk was calculating seconds. While the Germans were waiting for compliance, Funk was measuring distance, weight angles, and reach. The Thompson on his shoulder wasn't a symbol, it was a solution. The officer leaned in slightly, pressing the MP-40 harder into Funk's stomach, close enough to smell the cold metal, close enough to feel control. Around them, German soldiers relaxed just a fraction. Fingers loosened on triggers. No one rushed. No one shouted. They believed the moment had passed. They believed the American had broken. And in war, that belief kills more soldiers than bullets ever will. Because courage doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it laughs. And sometimes it waits for you to blink. The first burst hit the German officer square in the chest. The Thompson roared at point-blank range, 45 caliber rounds slamming into flesh and bone with the force of a sledgehammer. The officer was dead before his body hit the snow. Leonard Funk didn't stop. He couldn't. The moment he pulled that trigger, there was no retreat left in the world. This was no longer about escape or survival. It was about killing fast enough to stay alive. He pivoted, still firing, sweeping the muzzle across the nearest cluster of Germans. Men screamed. Bodies collapsed. Blood sprayed across the white snow, turning it dark and slick beneath their boots. Brass casings poured from the ejection port, hissing as they hit the ice. The magazine ran dry. For an instant, an eternity measured in heartbeats, everything hung in the balance. 90 Germans, 1 American. Reloading meant death if his hands hesitated even once. Funk didn't hesitate. Muscle memory took over. The empty magazine came out. A fresh one slammed home. The bolt racked. Less than 2 seconds. Training compressed into instinct. As he fired again, Funk screamed to his men, "Pick up their weapons! Pick up their weapons!" The 4 American guards lunged for rifles dropped by the dead and dying. Moments ago, they had been prisoners. Now they were fighting back, firing into Germans who had never expected resistance from their captives. Confusion exploded through the yard. Orders died with the officer. No one was in charge. Some Germans fired wildly. Bullets snapped past Funk's head. One round struck the American soldier beside him, killing him instantly. Funk didn't look back. He kept moving, kept shooting. Within seconds, the yard became a killing ground. Germans fell where they stood. Others dropped their weapons and raised their hands, terror replacing arrogance. The ambush collapsed before it ever began. It was over almost as quickly as it had started. 60 seconds. 21 Germans dead. 24 wounded. The rest surrendering, hands high, shaking in disbelief. Leonard Funk stood in the middle of it all, smoke drifting from his Thompson, surrounded by bodies where moments earlier surrender had been demanded. The snow around him was torn apart, churned by boots and blood and brass. That he finally said to his men, his voice flat and calm again, was the stupidest thing I've ever seen. But what Funk didn't say, what history would remember, was that those 60 seconds saved an entire company from being slaughtered from behind. And they sealed his place among the most extraordinary acts of courage ever recorded in war. The silence that followed felt unreal. Smoke drifted lazily above the farmhouse yard. Snow settled again, covering shell casings, broken rifles, and bodies that would never move. What had almost been a massacre ended instead as stunned surrender. The Germans who remained alive were marched away under heavy guard eyes, down shaken by how close they had come to victory and how violently it had been taken from them. Company C secured Holzheim by nightfall. Word spread quickly, the way stories always do in war. Men whispered it in foxholes and aid stations, passing it like contraband. A first sergeant who laughed at 90 Germans. A man who should have died and didn't. A moment so improbable it sounded like myth, but everyone knew it was true. When Leonard Funk reported the incident, he didn't dramatize it. He never did. He stated the facts. Enemy attempted breakout, officer neutralized, prisoners recaptured, just another firefight in a war full of them. But higher up the chain, no one missed what had happened. Overwhelming odds, a weapon pressed into his body, a refusal to surrender, a counterattack that saved an entire company from destruction. The recommendation moved fast. There were no arguments, no debates. The citation spoke for itself. On September 5, 1945, at the White House, President Harry Truman placed the Medal of Honor around Funk's neck. Truman looked at the small, quiet paratrooper and said words Funk would never repeat himself, that he would rather have that medal than be President of the United States. By the end of the war, Funk carried more decorations than almost any paratrooper, a live Medal of Honor, Distinguished Service. Cross Silver Star, Bronze Star, multiple Purple Hearts, and foreign awards from France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Medals earned not by seeking glory, but by refusing to fail when everything demanded surrender. Yet when the war ended, Leonard Funk did not become a legend in his own lifetime. He went home. He took a desk job helping other veterans find their way back into life. He never told the story unless pressed, and even then he shrugged it off. Because to Funk, what mattered wasn't the medals. It was the moment he decided long before Holzheim that when the rules died, when mercy vanished, and when the math said he was finished, he would still act. When the guns finally fell silent, Leonard Funk did something most legends never do. He disappeared. He went back to Pennsylvania, back to steel towns and narrow streets that looked nothing like Normandy hedgerows or frozen Belgian farms. He didn't write a book. He didn't tour the country, telling crowds how close he came to death. He didn't turn his Medal of Honor into a career. Instead, he took a job with the Veterans Administration, sitting behind a desk, helping other men untangle paperwork, file claims, and survive the long, quiet aftermath of war. For 27 years, he did that work, patient, anonymous, necessary. At home, he was a husband, a father of 2 daughters, a man who mowed his lawn, and paid his bills. The medals were there somewhere, locked away, rarely mentioned. When people asked about Holzheim, about the laughter about the 90 Germans, Funk would shrug. Did what I had to do, he'd say. Nothing more. On November 20th, 1992, Leonard Alfred Funk Jr. died of cancer at the age of 76. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery, among presidents, generals, and thousands of young men who never came home. At the time of his death, he was the last living Medal of Honor recipient from the 82nd Airborne Division of World War II. Today, a fitness center bears his name. A highway carries it. A post office was dedicated to him decades later. Yet most Americans have never heard of Leonard Funk. They know louder heroes, bigger names, men who fit the image. But war doesn't choose heroes by size, strength, or volume. It chooses them in moments when the odds are impossible, when fear is total, when surrender is reasonable. At Holzheim, Leonard Funk stood with a gun in his stomach and 90 enemies in front of him. The math said he was finished. History said he should have raised his hands. Instead, he laughed. And in 60 seconds, he showed the world what courage really is, not the absence of fear, but the decision to act when fear has already won.